Today we're venturing deep into the heart of 10 disturbing true Appalachian Mountains horror stories, where the land is as vast as its legends, and just as terrifying. From eerie lights haunting dark rivers to ancient forces that never should have been disturbed, get ready for Appalachian Mountains, of the most disturbing true Appalachian Mountains. Horror stories that will make you question what's real and what's lurking just beyond the horizon. I've walked those ridgelines after sundown, where the silence has weight and the trees lean in to listen. Out there, a bell with no rope can sound once and carry for miles. Footsteps appear beside your own, then stop at 6, as if the ground is waiting for you to take the last step at once. Old cabins breathe through the chinks and the wind tests your name like a key in a lock. This is where light moves without a source and trails loop back to the same gate you swear you didn't pass. Tonight, in 10 disturbing true Appalachian Mountains horror stories, we follow voices that sound too much like the living, roads that fold over themselves, and bloodlines that carry debts older than the churchyards. We keep to the slow path. Low light, careful breath. One rule: do not answer if the dark calls you first. Hold your coat close, keep your count, and don't look over your shoulder when the leaves shift. If you're ready, keep your voice down and your eyes open. Story 1 begins now. Story 1: The Map That Hums at Night. I opened my father's lockbox because the house would not sleep until I did, and because the envelope inside had my name on it in his careful block letters and a warning written across the fold. Do not unfold. After midnight. It was already past midnight when my thumb slid under the flap, so the rule was broken before the paper breathed. The map came out soft with age and rubbed smooth along the edges, and the moment it touched the table it made a sound like a throat clearing in the dark. Not loud, but steady. A small hum that sat in the boards and in my bones. I told myself it was nothing. That old paper sometimes holds a sound the way it holds a smell, but the lines on that map would not settle. They wavered as if the mountains were not quite finished being drawn, as if the ridges were standing somewhere else, and the ink had sketched only their shadows. Down in the corner a legend ran like a stitched scar. Brown Mountain Lights, Clinchfield Loop, Widow's Hollow, Devil's Circle, Coffin Creek. Next to our surname, penciled in light strokes, almost shy, someone had pressed a fingertip hard enough to leave a small oval where the graphite had shined. My father's breath seemed to be in the room again. The way the air gets heavier when a man too large for small spaces stands just out of sight. The house answered the hum with its own old wood song, a beam settling, the soft knock of a joist, the sighing you hear when winter finally agrees to let the night go. I stood with my palms flat and willed the paper to stop moving, but the roads on the map bent their backs. The creeks uncoiled, and every hollow grew a little darker than it had been a blink earlier. The smell rising out of that fold was creek water and iron and leaf mold, and under it all the red clay scent that sits wet under the floorboards after rain. I read the note again and told myself I would put the map away in the morning. But I was not a morning man where my father's secrets were concerned, so I took the map in both hands and folded it once the wrong way, and the hum grew warmer, like a mouth brought close to my ear. The clock in the hall took a breath between ticks, and in that small space I heard the distant single strike of the church bell that has no rope. One note only, as if a hand I could not see had pushed the clapper with a finger, and then gone, satisfied to leave the sound walking the ridge by itself. I should have left. I know that now, but a rule that has already been broken does not sit back down easily. So I traced the line that ran from our porch to the white church with the leaning graveyard, and found a pencil circle at the gate with a warning in cramped script: don't count past 6. I said the words out loud to hear how they felt in my mouth, and the hum answered twice like agreement. I put on my coat, slid the map into the inside pocket where for years my father kept a small silver whistle he never blew after the yard shut down, and the paper lay there too warm for paper, as if it had found a pulse and liked it. Outside, the mountain had the same look it always has at midnight when it is thinking about men. Patient, polite, and unwilling to hold your hand. Frost made, the grass speak under my boots. The road to the old church turns twice and then climbs, and each bend felt a little narrower than it should have, as if the trees leaned in to see who I was bringing. When I reached the gate, I found the iron colder than the air around it. metal that had chosen its own weather. The stones beyond the fence leaned like teeth worrying their own gums, and the ground had that springy give the hill keeps for itself when it is in a mood. I forgot about not counting until I had already stepped through and heard my mind say one. I did not mean to, but habit is a kind of rope you carry without feeling it, and it tightened with each footfall. 2, the wind on my neck as if someone old enough to know better were reading over my shoulder. 3, tobacco smoke that had no source, and a sweet hint of yeast rolls from a dinner that ended before I was born. 4, the bell tower's empty mouth turning toward me like a question. 5, frost lifting in a thin breath from the grass itself. 6, the map humming inside my coat as if it had learned my heartbeat and wanted to count along. I stopped there, pleased with myself like a child who has kept a promise for once and turned to smile at the foolishness of it, only to feel the ground shift the smallest amount, as if something behind me had put down a 7th step on the hollow side of my heel. I did not look because men here do not look when the ground asks them not to, but my name arrived anyway, close to my left ear, spoken not by a mouth but by cold itself. First, middle, last, each part clipped the way a clerk reads a ledger. I told the dark it had the wrong house, and my voice sounded like a man who wants to be brave but has brought the wrong shoes. A woman sat on the bench by the gate, or I thought she did, because I never saw her stand. Only felt the bench lighten. She said without moving her lips, "You stop at 6 or you belong to the grass." And the way belong landed in my chest told me it was not a kindness. I backed out, slow and polite, and the iron gate clicked itself shut, happy to have done its part. The map burned hot against my ribs until I touched it through the coat and it cooled, shy again. I drove down the hill with my headlights thinner than they should have been, the beams narrowing as if they were shy too, and at the first turn a light moved across the road and did not belong to me. Too low for a car, too steady for a firefly. It eased by as though it had other places to be and my hood was only a pond. It could cross. I have heard brown mountain light since I was a boy, described as swamp gas by people too far from swamps and as ball lightning by men who want the world to be clever and not personal. This light was personal. When I said my father's name, it paused and then dipped, like a respectful nod from a stranger who knows your family's business. I do not tell a light my father's name twice, so I put the car in neutral and let the mountain decide the first 10 feet. The hum from the map shifted, a rail song now, a steel-on-steel whisper I felt in my ankles. I was not at the tracks, and yet the night had put a trestle under me. Memory or warning, I could not tell. I parked by the overlook where the sign is long gone and the view remains, black ridges layered like the backs of cattle standing still, and laid the map on the hood. Moonlight found the pencil lines and made them look wet. Places I knew had changed places. Coffin Creek sat too close to Widow's Hollow. The Clinchfield Loop cut a straight line like a dare, and the pasture rim I avoid after storms wore a faint ring the color of ash. The legend in the corner, my father's hand or a hand that had borrowed his neatness, had added a thin new rule. Beneath the others, pay with sound. The paper thrummed like a low string when I said it. The wind carried a small laugh, and it had my grandmother's thimble in it. I remembered her jar shelf then, cotton-stoppered glass lined up for respect, not for spells, and the way she sealed the wax as if she were closing little doors inside the wind so it would mind itself. The map warmed again, and I had the strong, simple feeling that if I folded it now and walked back into the house, I would find the jar shelf moved, a space cleared, a new jar waiting with cotton and wax and my name notched under the rim. The night around me stretched, and the simple act of standing there became difficult. I felt watched in a way that was not eyes. The ridge had turned its head. That was all. A distant train called a note I could not hear but could feel, and the ties under my feet, wood that was not there, answered with their old song. Off to my right, the light returned and split into 2, and then into 3, as if a single thought had broken into ideas and each idea wanted its own path. They moved in a slow braid, listening. When I breathed, they brightened. When I held still, they dimmed. I said the name of the next place on the map, too soft to be pride, too loud to be safe, and the lights shifted toward the clinch field, slow as a funeral procession. My father's whistle, which I had given back to him when the hospital room got quiet, pressed against my chest from inside the coat where it could not be. A cold shape under warm cloth, and the map's hum matched it. The way two men hum the same hymn under their breath at a grave, each unaware of the other. I told myself to close the lockbox in my mind and go home and sleep and let the hill keep its numbers, and then the bell with no rope tolled once across the ridge and once more, and in the second fading ring I heard a footstep behind me. Not on gravel, not on leaves, but in the thin layer of frost on the paint of the car, as if someone had placed a bare sole on the hood next to the map and shifted their weight to climb into the light. I looked up, and the lights leaned down to meet whoever had joined me, and the paper on the hood began to hum in a higher key that I knew too well. The sound the ground makes when it decides the next step you take will not be yours. Story 2. Brown Mountains Borrowed Lights. The old men called them borrowed lights because they never seemed to be their own, always taking the shine they needed from something else. A lantern that wasn't lit, a window that wasn't open, a man whose eyes were too tired to argue. Standing at the overlook with the map spread on my hood and frost filming the paint, I watched the first orb detach from the ridge like a thought separating from a prayer and drift sideways as if the night had a current. It wasn't bright the way a headlamp is bright. It was patient, a pearl held in a black hand. After Story 1's footstep on the hood, the seventh step I refused to own, the orb leaned toward the map as if reading, and in the reflection I saw my father's careful block letters even though I knew there were only pencil lines and warnings. People have a dozen explanations they trade like recipes. Swamp gas in a land with no swamp, headlights refracting off a highway too far to matter, ball lightning that behaves like a taut animal. But the light in front of me behaved like a listener who wanted something I did not want to give. I said my father's name once soft, the way a boy asks for water so he doesn't wake the house, and the light dipped as if nodding. A second orb slid out from behind the first like a bead of mercury splitting, and then a third, so that three pale faces hovered above my windshield, and the map hummed a low string under my hand. When I lifted my palm from the paper, the hum stayed in my bones. Old folks say the lights borrow the only measures that matter up here, breath and time, and they return both at a rate the mountain likes better. I learned what that meant when my watch hesitated between seconds, then decided to keep the extra moment for itself. The car clock went dumb. The radio came alive with a station I knew was dead, and in the static a voice like mine said my full name the way a ledger does. First, middle, last. Say it back, I whispered, and the light tried. It used my father's tone and missed the little lift he put at the end of my middle name when he was proud of me. It used my grandmother's breath and left out the thimble that always showed in her vowels. That's what the borrowed lights do. They return what they take with a seam showing, a stitch out of place. Wind tested my ear and asked for the name again, curious more than hungry, and I reached for the map as if paper could be a door I could close. When I folded once, the lights dimmed. When I unfolded, they brightened. I tried to leave them by starting the car, but the key turned into silence like a thin apology, and the dome light failed to glow. Instead, frost bloomed on the passenger seat and pulled itself into the shape of a heel, then the ball of a foot, then toes pressed as if a careful person had just climbed in. The seat sank an inch and stopped. A seatbelt clicked, though no hand moved. I kept my eyes forward because I am my father's son, and we do not stare at things we don't intend to invite. Outside, the three orbs arranged themselves into a gentle arc that bowed over the hood and lowered until the glow met the glass, and in the windshield a pale field opened that was not the sky, not the road, but something like a pond at night when it holds the moon, and you can't tell which surface the light belongs to. I thought then of the phrase the elders use when they don't want a child to follow. The trail loops, they say, which is mountain for you will walk and end up where we told you not to begin. The light seemed to know that rule better than I did. I put my hand to the place in my coat where the whistle shouldn't be and felt the little metal weight waiting, cold as a winter truth. I lifted it to my mouth because the legend on the map, my father's neat hand or some neatness that borrowed it, had added, "Pay with sound." The whistle did what it always does when the ground is listening. It called nothing and everything else answered. The trees behind me sang a thin note through their twigs. The frost on the hood rang like a glass finger tapped once. The orbs lengthened into threads, and those threads braided and untwisted, until they looked like someone weaving with light in a room without furniture. I stepped back from the car without wanting to, counting without numbers. 1, air colder at my neck. 2, the smell of iron as if a bell had been handled. 3, the map's hum matching my pulse even though I had told it not to. 4, the taste of creek water. 5, the shape of the Clinchfield trestle entering my mind like an uninvited guest. 6, the wind saying my surname with the same small affection a ledger saves for a familiar debt. I stopped, and behind me the pressure of a 7th step leaned into my shoulder blades with the care of a hand that knows exactly how much to push without bruising. Not tonight, I said to no one and to everything, and the lights drifted sideways, offering what looked like a path. It was not a line on the ground. It was a procession in the air, low, floating above the edge of the overlook, moving toward the black of Linville Gorge as if a slow river had lifted itself up to eye level. Time there began to sound like tapping on wood from a room I couldn't enter. The radio static turned into the last 2 bars of an old hymn and then back into nothing. My watch made up its mind and skipped 3 minutes to catch up. I realized what the borrowing had taken. Not hours, not years, but the simple feeling that there would be a morning, and that loss joined the others I keep. A father's empty chair, a shelf of jars with cotton stoppers I never should have touched, a house that adds rooms when a name goes silent. I told the lights they had enough. My name in the air, my breath in the cold, my patience, and the smallest one slipped behind the others and reappeared on my left, so close the glass shivered. In its glow I saw a mistake only a thief makes. It spelled my middle name in the fog on the windshield with the wrong turn on the 2nd letter, the way a city clerk wrote it once on a hunting permit. The light had borrowed the wrong paper. Anger is not a tool that works in these hills, but a little of it helped me think. I turned the map to the legend and traced the penciled words as if they could be scripture. Brown Mountain Lights, Clinchfield Loop, Widow's Hollow, Devil's Circle, Coffin Creek, and below Pay with Sound. You can borrow mine, I said, but I'll be here when you come back to return it. And I whistled again, not through the metal, but through my teeth the way my father did under his breath when he didn't want the job to feel hard. The sound was small. A man's private habit, but it made the orbs falter. One rose, one tilted, one dimmed to a coal and then flared. In that movement I saw a shape I knew. 3 men lifting a box the day we put my father in the ground. Shoulders uneven. One taller, one shorter. One counting under his breath for the last 6 ruts to the hole. The light had taken that memory and fitted it to itself like a coat. It expected me to follow it down the ridge and into the dark, because I had already walked that way once. I looked over the stone wall at the sheer drop and the black among the trees where the gorge breathes. The light stepped off into nothing and didn't fall. I set the map back on the hood and the paper hummed in a higher note. The rail song I knew but had never earned. And the braid of light turned down the mountain to where the old Clinchfield tracks hook the hillside and loop over themselves like a rope coiled by a man who forgot he was making a noose. I didn't think. I moved the way a boy moves when he hears his name called by a voice that sounds exactly right and can't be, and the car door shut itself behind me with the polite finality of a prayer ending. The path the lights made did not touch ground, but the ground touched me. Steady, amused, ready to tally. Trees gave me back my breath a little at a time as if charging interest. By the first switchback, I no longer had any certainty about how long I'd been walking, though my body remembered every step and filed them. 6 and then a waiting. 6 and then a waiting. A ledger that would not close. The braid of light pulled me under a low branch where my father used to shake snow for me to laugh beneath. And for that insult the wind put his cough into my ear. When I reached the grade where the rails begin their argument with the slope, the light stopped and hung motionless over the trestle, and far below, where the track doubles on itself, another light woke and answered. The hum in the map, pressed against my chest now like a second sternum, aligned with a vibration in the metal I had not yet touched, and I knew 2 things without drama. First, that the borrowed lights wanted me to step onto the ties and keep their count for them. Second, that the 7th step would not be mine to choose. The orbs lowered until their glow reached my boots, a pale, coaxing tide. Behind me there was a small, familiar sound, a single bell stroke with no rope, coming from the direction of the church I had left, late and on time both. Ahead, the trestle breathed the way an animal does when it's about to run. The middle light edged forward and I followed because I was already in the part of the story where a man pretends he has any other choice. The first tie held, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and when I stopped, the wood under my soles went soft the way the ground does when it decides to accept you. The light turned, patient as a debt, and looked at me without eyes. I opened my mouth to say no, and something stepped onto the seventh tie behind me, close as a hand on my back, and the trestle began to sing. Story 3. The Clinchfield Loop Without a Whistle. I came to the Clinchfield before dawn because the map in my coat would not stop humming in the low rail note that gets into bone and makes your teeth remember nails, and because the 3 borrowed lights had braided themselves down the slope as if the night were a slow river, teaching me where to step. The loop is a stubborn place where track argues the mountain into giving up an inch at a time, curling back over itself in stacked circles so a train can climb without looking foolish, trestles stilted into air, cuts opened like doors in stone, ballast shouldered up against old timber that knows more names than the church registry. My father said once, when he still had breath to spare, that a thing which can't say your name doesn't need to whistle, and I thought he meant not to trust machinery, but out here the meaning changed. Because something was coming on the line with no horn, no headlamp, only the old arithmetic of weight and steel, and the patience to wait for a man to count wrong. The fog along the gorge hung low and still like steam that had decided to keep its shape, and the rails were black threads laid across it, gleaming where frost had made a thin lace and then given up. I stepped onto the shoulder and felt the ballast shift the small honest way gravel does when it gives you a choice and waits to see what you will do with it. The humming in the map found my ankles and began to climb, and a breath that was not mine brushed the hair at my temple with the heavy sweetness of coal smoke from a decade that had already forgiven me. I told myself to stay off the iron, and then my feet did what my father's feet had done, what his father's had done. 1, 2, 3, easy and sure across the ties, the wood springy and cold. The 7th step is the one the ground wants, so I stopped at 6 and let the plank hold me like a hand that knows where not to squeeze. Under me the trestle sighed. A long, tired voice through bolts and plates, and down in the dark the creek's voice thinned to a hiss. A man appeared where the cut began. Not ghost white and not dripping. Just a section hand the mountain had kept, cap, vest, shirt sleeves to the elbow. One suspender knotted back after a snap. A lantern with a cracked globe that showed a flame only when I looked away. Off the iron, he said without surprise, like a weather report. I'm off if the track says I'm off, I told him, and he nodded at my coat pocket where the warm paper lay breathing. Not from that you ain't, he said, and raised the lantern until the light had a chance to measure my face. He didn't ask my name, men working this. Close to ground and steel don't want to owe more syllables than they can pay back, but he looked at my boots the way elders look at a boy's shoes and know what kind of man he will be by how he ties them. You hear a whistle? He asked. No, I said, and he smiled without humor. Then whatever's on the line is closer than you like, and it already knows your count. Down is cheaper than up, but the bill comes either way, he said, and the map twitched like a fish under a net. I took a careful step to the ballast, still 6. And the rails gave a thin high note like a glass in a quiet room when someone thinks a toast without saying it. Far below, a coupler banged like a door closing in a concrete hall. The air moved across my legs without wind, and the lantern flame went long and blue as a mouth blowing out candles. You keep what you call, or it keeps you, he added gently. And then he was in the cut, not stepping, not ducking, just no longer where he had been, as if the stone preferred him and had taken him back. I wanted to be a man who chooses wisely, so I told myself I would back away and leave the loop to its old work. But the wide truth is the ground likes to decide a second ahead of you, and that is how I looked down and saw my boot prints marching ahead across the ties without me. The sharp heel, the smaller drag of the ball, the uneven right foot that my father used to laugh about when I was a boy. I stooped and put a palm to one print and felt warmth as if the step had just been placed by some version of my body that had not asked me first. I tossed a stone toward the next tie to test the spell, and the pebble struck and bounced and then hung a breath too long mid-air, reluctant to finish its fall, as if the loop had to remember whether gravity still belonged to it. From the hung fog came the church bell's single strike, late wrong direction, perfect pitch, and I knew then that sound would be the price, the way the legend on the map had promised. I took out the silver whistle that should not have been in my pocket, the one my father wore when he worked yard safety, cold as an insult against the tongue, and lifted it before my mouth like a man about to beg. I blew and nothing came, but the rails sang back anyway. The trees above me shook their ends in a thin chime. The bolts in the plates walked a hare. The long timbers under me answered with a note that settled into the places where a man keeps the names he won't say out loud. The borrowed lights reappeared then, low and polite, hovering just off the trestle. And for a few breaths they looked like lanterns brought by men who stayed late after a wreck, to right things they could not. Not tonight, I told them, and my voice sounded small and heavy both. The watch on my wrist clicked ahead 3 minutes as if time were a mule that had balked and then remembered itself. And the radio in the car, back at the Overlook, crackled to life with my father's cough and his quiet order from so many years ago. Put it up, meaning the map, meaning the sound, meaning the pride I carried fixed against my chest. I did not put it up. I placed the whistle on the flange of the near rail, metal to metal, a small honest payment any track will accept, and tapped it once with my knuckle. The note went traveling down the line, not fast, not slow. Just the speed a dew takes to reach the right desk. Somewhere around the second loop a reply came. Back not a whistle, not even a horn, but a weight answering a question by stepping closer. The air compressed without moving. The fog pinched into threads, and the map in my pocket matched the rhythm beat for beat. I stepped forward because I had already done it, my prints proved it, and counted without wanting to. 1. Iron cold through my boot sole. 2. Creosote climbing my throat. 3. Breath taken and not returned. 4. Lantern flame leaning toward me as if to listen. 5. Coupler bang below. Then another farther off like a door echo. 6. The long sigh of timber learning me. I held there and felt the 7th step arrive without my help. A pressure at the back of the knee. The kind a father gives a boy when it's time to cross the street. The trestle began to sing in the same lonely key it uses for night storms, and across the cut the section hand's lantern shook once in a wind that didn't reach me. I looked down through the ties at the black gleam of the creek, a small, patient constant that has watched every argument between men and mountain, and always picks the winning side after the fact. And I told it I would be careful, and it said nothing because water doesn't talk to men who are about to lie. The humming rose. The steel underfoot had the feel of a big animal shifting in its pen, and the air ahead of me shaped itself around. Something long that wore the dust of years like a coat. I could smell hot bearings and cinder grit, hear brake shoes kiss a wheel, and still there was no engine to see. A breath, human-sized and close, warmed my neck, and the map lifted a corner on its own like a hand asking for quiet. Off the iron, the section hand said from inside the cut. His voice now Stone's voice, and I knew he wasn't warning me because he... Back not a whistle, not even a horn, but a weight answering a question by stepping closer. The air compressed without moving. The fog pinched into threads, and the map in my pocket matched the rhythm beat for beat. I stepped forward because I had already done it. My prints proved it, and counted without wanting to. 1. Iron cold through my boot sole. 2. A creosote climbing my throat. 3. Breath taken and not returned. 4. Lantern flame leaning toward me as if to listen. 5. Coupler bang below, then another farther off like a door echo. 6. The long sigh of timber learning me. I held there and felt the 7th step arrive without my help. A pressure at the back of the knee. The kind a father gives a boy when it's time to cross the street. The trestle began to sing in the same lonely key it uses for night storms, and across the cut, the section hand's lantern shook once in a wind that didn't reach me. I looked down through the ties at the black gleam of the creek, a small, patient constant that has watched every argument between men and mountain and always picks the winning side after the fact. And I told it I would be careful, and it said nothing because water doesn't talk to men who are about to lie. The humming rose. The steel underfoot had the feel of a big animal shifting in its pen, and the air ahead of me shaped itself around something long that wore the dust of years like a coat. I could smell hot bearings and cinder grit, hear brake shoes kiss a wheel, and still there was no engine to see. A breath, human-sized and close, warmed my neck, and the map lifted a corner on its own like a hand asking for quiet. Off the iron, the section hand said from inside the cut. His voice now Stone's voice, and I knew he wasn't warning me because he enjoyed it, but because he remembered the taste of rail in his mouth and wanted me to have different memories. I turned to step back to the ballast, and the tie tilted the other way, holding my heel a fraction longer than it should have. A polite detention while the loop checked its sums. In that small delay, the invisible front of the train reached me. Not a nose, not a grill, but a decision moving forward. I could feel the mass the way you feel a truck pass on a bridge while you're under it. Every bolt noticing, every plate leaning its shoulder. I tried the whistle again, mouth to metal, and felt the instrument take in my breath and keep it like a miser takes pennies to polish them later. Beyond the trestle, the brown mountain lights lined the far loop like distant block signals in a yard that had been closed since the last prayer anyone believed, and they winked in a rhythm that tried to match my heart and failed by one beat. Always by one beat. "Say your name," the fog requested with the same small kindness the wind used down at Widow's Hollow. But I clenched my teeth, held it, wouldn't give the mountain another handle on me. The section hand's lantern lifted, and for an instant his face showed not dead, not living, just busy. The way men look when they've balanced a load that ought to drop and it doesn't. "Down is cheaper," he repeated. And inside the cut, a second light answered, 1-2, the count of the men who used to walk ahead of a night local with flags when rock came down on the line. The coupler slam sounded again, close enough to move the air in my throat and the rail under the whistle. Vibrated so hard the little silver thing skated and was saved only by my fingers. I had to choose. Step forward into the cut where the mountain had kept a place for me, or step back and let the seventh step belong to the ground and to whatever rode it. The trestle sang louder. The kind of song that becomes a story men tell after, and I couldn't tell if I was already inside the after. The lights on Brown Mountain brightened as if they wanted to see better. And below me water turned, its face away. I lifted my foot, forward or back I won't say, and the map in my pocket twisted like it was trying to climb into my ribs to hide, and a hand made of cinders closed gentle around my ankle, not to hurt, but to guide. And the last thing I heard before the rail took my sound for its own was the section hand calling from the dark. Not my name, not a warning, just one word that has more than one meaning here. Hurry. Story 4. Widow's Hollow and the names in the wind. I don't remember how I left the trestle, only that the rail gave back my breath like a creditor offering me one more day to set my account right, and I walked until the map in my coat cooled and the light between the beeches thinned to the color of old milk. Widow's Hollow sits where 3 draws meet and argue. One brings mountain chill even in July. One carries damp like a low fever. And one comes empty-handed and then takes what you didn't mean to offer. My father always said the wind there doesn't blow. It chooses. It steps up beside the ear at once and speaks a name into it like a key trying locks. If you answer, it answers back and keeps your syllables the way a creek keeps coins. If you don't, the ground writes your refusal down and waits. I went because every road the map gave me bent toward this dip like iron leans toward a magnet, and because the legend my father wrote or borrowed had placed a small, exact warning by its name. Do not answer. Do not count. The trail-in was a seam in rhododendron that brushed my sleeves and then held them. Not cruel, only insistent. As if the laurel meant to steady me while the slope decided. The air smelled of crushed leaves and a sweetness that didn't fit. Yeast and rind. From dinners and houses no one lives in now. I passed a locust with lightning scars that ran like stitches and stopped to listen. When the hollow wants you, even cicadas fall quiet like a congregation at the moment in the service where the prayer shifts from general to particular. And it wanted me. My watch had lost 2 minutes on the ridge, and down here it lost the idea of minutes entirely. Its second hand slid, then waited, then gave up. And in the pause the wind came to my left ear like a neighbor leaning over a fence. Polite and too familiar. My full name, first, middle, last in my father's cadence. The lift he put on my middle when he was proud of me. Not a perfect copy. Just off enough to ache. Say it back. The wind asked lightly. The way a woman tests if a boy has learned his letters, and I kept my teeth on each other like a man holding in a cough in a church that is tired of him. Say it back. It tried again, smaller, kinder, which is worse, and I touched the map through my coat and felt the paper warm, as if it had leaned its head against my ribs to listen too. I had brought a jar from my grandmother's shelf, not to open, only to give the hollow something to want more than me if it came to it. A squat glass with wax thumb smoothed and cotton pressed clean. The weight of it in my pack made a domestic sound when I shifted, a kitchen memory clicking against brush and root, and I told myself that if the wind pressed I would set the jar down like a plate at the end of a meal to say there, take that. The first step into the clearing counted itself. 1. And I thought of the churchyard rule and of the way habits are ropes that hang in the mind long after the bell is gone. I told myself I would not count, and the second step counted too, and I told myself I would stop, and the third counted anyway, 3, because the ground had started at sums, and was pleased to find my feet willing clerks. I halted at 6 and felt the hollow wait the way a judge waits when he already knows the sentence, and only wants to see what sentence a man will pronounce upon himself first. In the center of the dip, the grass had failed long ago and never forgiven itself. A bald patch the size of a room with the corners worn soft by seasons. People say a widow made it, and the story moves depending on who needs it to fit. Some say she called 5 sons out of a mine by their names, and the wind learned how her grief shaped the syllables and practiced on the rest of us. Some say she set out jars the night the river ran black with tailings, 1 jar for every neighbor who would not come home, and the wind rattled them empty one by one and kept the glass for music. My grandmother wouldn't tell me which version was true. Widows are true enough without their details, she said, and now the hollow offered to show me its detail with my own name. The laurel leaves turned their pale undersides toward me like hands taking oaths. The wind changed ears and moved to the right side with my mother's Sunday voice, the one she used when she asked men to lower theirs, then to the back of my neck with the breath of a boy I worked beside one summer, who slipped under a tractor and died quiet. Then to the left again with my own mouth. And that was the worst. Hearing me in the shape the mountain preferred, a shade grudging, a hair too sure. Say it, the wind coaxed, and the beech leaves quivered as if they knew a joke that would hurt me when I got it. I opened the pack instead of my mouth and slid the jar to the ground. The cotton thumped once against the glass and the wax held, and the wind drew back a small degree the way a dog does when a man puts down bread and says no without anger. You brought a sealed door, it said, almost amused. We like doors. I didn't answer. I stood on 6 and let my legs learn what belonging would feel like, because there's no point pretending you can't imagine it. Belonging to ground is rest at first. It's a bed that remembers your shape. It's the end of errands. It's the long breath after the last table is cleared. Then it is a wait. Then it is the end of your name. The hollow stepped closer, not with wind. There was still no wind, but with choice, and choice has toes. The map in my coat hummed the rail note again, irritated as if to say, this is not your ledger. Say your father's name, the voice suggested, balancing pity and threat like a tray on one hand. And when I would not, it offered me a cheaper price. Say yours. It is a rule older than my people here, that a thing which gets your name gets your breath whenever it is in the mood for it, and that a jar with cotton and wax is only a polite suggestion, not a law. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and thought of a hymn my father hummed when he needed to carry something heavy until another pair of hands arrived. I filled the space behind my teeth with tune and not with letters. The hollow did not enjoy my song. It prefers men quiet, not careful. We will count for you, it said without malice, and in the laurel there was the small dry percussion of leaves tapping after a hand has left them, and the numbers came, not aloud, only present. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each number pulling the breath in my chest a half-inch lower like a clerk moving coins into a drawer. The 7th did not come because I would not move and because something behind me decided to move instead. A step, soft as a child trying to be, brave for a scolding, touched down on the part of the clearing my heel would have met if I had leaned. The air at my ear turned colder by one season. It isn't always a ghost, the hollow murmured, embarrassed for me, which is a trick. Sometimes it's a conversation you didn't finish. I could taste iron in the back of my throat the way you do when you bite your tongue, not to answer a question that deserves a better man. The jar made a sound like glass remembering sand, a small settling, and I thought of my grandmother smoothing wax with her thumb and telling the wind to mind its manners. You can pay with sound, I whispered before I could stop the words, and the hollow leaned in as if I had offered it both my wrists to hold. Then pay, it breathed, not with demand, but with expectation, and expectation in these hills is stronger than anger. I took my father's whistle out and held it where its cold could tell me the truth. The last time I put metal to mouth in the loop, the track answered, and I survived on account of someone else's pity. Down here, metal would give the hollow my breath on a clean plate. I raised the whistle anyway because the choice to refuse is a thin, proud kind of cowardice when the ground has already made its numbers and will only be delayed. I didn't blow. Instead, I tapped the whistle against my thumbnail, and let the sound be small and stubborn, and the laurel applauded with leaf tips. The hollow moved around me, testing, not a circle, more like a curl of handwriting that has not decided whether to end with a flourish. "Your people keep doors," it said, looking at the jar without eyes. "They seal words as if the wind were a child who needs rules. They think names can be put away for later, like winter quilts. We are not winter. We are the hand that opens drawers when you sleep." The cotton twitched and my name arrived again in my own voice, mispronounced. I laughed because anger had left and fear had gotten tired, and laughter is sometimes the only clean thing left in a man. And the hollow did not like that. It pushed the sound back into my mouth as if to say we decide when noise happens. A beech at the rim dropped one brown leaf out of time, and it hung on the way down longer than it should have, the air reluctant to let it go. I wanted to say my father's name then, not to pay, not to belong, but because I missed him. Wanted to say it quietly so the hollow would know the difference between grief and surrender. I did not. I held the whistle until the metal learned my heat and forgot its own. I set it on the jar's lid so they touched, sealed breath and unspent sound, and the curve of glass received the weight as if that were what it had been made for. "Let me see you," the hollow said almost to itself, and the clearing brightened without light. The way a memory brightens when the person who carries it is finally ready to tell it without making himself look good. The grass that had failed made a new attempt to be green. The laurel put one blossom out of season. The ground sighed the way a bed sighs when the last person finally lies down. "Say it," the voice insisted once more. No longer pleading, only completing the form, and somewhere behind me the seventh step drew breath and held it. I thought foolishly of the house on the pasture rim that adds a room when a name goes quiet. I thought of a door that would not yet open for me, because I have been spared more than I deserve. I thought of a thin chain inside a walnut trunk, and of a bell with no rope, and of lights that borrow their shine and forget to return it with the right seam. The map warmed as if to nudge me in the ribs. Do not answer. Do not count. I didn't. I let the wind press my name against me without giving it back. And in that refusal the hollow found another way. It took my voice without my mouth and spoke my name in my voice into the clearing, and the ground below my boots accepted the word as payment, because it had the sound it wanted. And the last clean piece of air between my heel and the dirt went thin as paper. Somewhere far off a bell struck once. Somewhere nearer a jar breathed out the smallest fog. The wind stepped back, satisfied. The seventh step moved forward, and the floor of the hollow gave the gentle, unmistakable shrug of a door beginning to open from underneath. Story 5. Goatman at the Switchback Grade. I left Widow's Hollow the way a man leaves a room where someone has begun to speak his name in his own voice, slow, without turning my back until I was certain the ground would let me, every root and rock asking for a small toll under my boots, then climbed until the damp fell away and the air smelled like iron and sunburned grass. The road that threads above Coffin Creek is a switchback that doesn't apologize. Two tight hairpins braced by a grade so steep, the ditch gnaws itself into a culvert every spring, and it was there at the bend where you can taste red clay when the wind is wrong, that the hill put him in my way. I knew him before I saw him. The copper-sweet hayloft smell of a storm trapped in wood. The low rasp that isn't quite breath and isn't quite gravel rolling in a tin pan. The stillness a ditch keeps when it has decided to watch you. Then he stood, half in shade, half in the right kind of daylight to show what a mouth like his does with a man's vowels. Horns would be a lie to tell you, and hooves too easy. His head had the clean outline of something that clears briars without hands, and his legs carried the memory of small, careful steps taken by a man trying not to wake a sleeping house. And it was the wrong combination that made him loyal to every bad story I'd ever heard at a fence line. "You brought the wind a door," he said without moving his lips, and I felt the jar in my pack answer with a chill against my spine because I had snatched it, and the whistle both when the floor of the hollow shrugged from underneath. I kept to the crown of the road because the ditch was his, the way rails belonged to rails, and measured my breathing on purpose the way my father did when a mule got nervous. "I brought it back out," I said, and he cocked his head the way a sheep tilts to look through wire, amused by a man who doesn't know what he owes. "Your people count like men who think the ground keeps their numbers for them," he said, and the grade behind him made a sound like a hand settling on a shoulder, just enough pressure to tell you where to stand. He reached into the culvert shadow where the water had chewed its mouth too wide, and lifted a length of chain laid over his palm, as if iron sought him out when it was tired of pretending to be anything else. The links were the bell's old rope turned honest by rust, each oval polished by a million pulls and then stained by seasons not spent in a steeple, and a few gray hairs were snarled through one bend. Woman's hair, careful grief writ small. "Pay with sound," he said gently, like a mother reminding a boy to wipe his boots. "I already have," I told him, and the whistle in my pocket cooled to prove I lied. He laid the chain on the shoulder between us, and the grade leaned as if to eavesdrop, the stones settling into a new, attentive quiet. Cars do not pass at that hour when the ridge is still tasting night. Only birds making their first low talk and a distant creek, cutting itself thin, but the road had the listening posture of a congregation that expects to be ashamed of something by the time the sermon ends. "You're walking toward a room that wasn't there yesterday," he said, almost fond. "And you want the door not to know your name when you arrive." "I want to keep what's mine," I said, and he smiled with his eyes where a man keeps his appetite out of politeness. "You carry what calls you," he replied, "and you pay either way." I didn't argue because these hills don't respect men who try to win with language. So I set the pack down on the gravel and let the jar breathe its cold against the day, and took the whistle out to show I understood the terms. "Not that sound," he said, and I was ashamed of how quickly my hand obeyed. He nodded at the chain. "This one remembers better." I picked it up, and the weight traveled into my elbow with the exact ache my people carry after a day of lifting what isn't going to move unless you convince it with patience. And when I let the first link slide across my palm, a thin note rose. Not metal on metal. Not quite. More like a bell thinking in its sleep about ringing. "Where did it come from?" I asked. And he nodded toward the trunk of a walnut farther up the bank where wire from an old fence disappeared into bark and never came out. "Trees keep what churches misplace," he said, and the chain tugged once in my hands like a hooked fish that remembers the pond. He stepped nearer, not closing distance so much as letting distance decide to be less, and I saw how his shoulders didn't match. How the left was man and the right had learned a different style of strength, hill strength, ditch strength, the strength of a road that bears weight without asking for applause. "You smell like rail," he said, pleased and a little sorry, and like jars, less pleased. The map in my coat warmed and then cooled, wanting to be noticed and then deciding not to be. Down in the culvert, something moved without surface. Water with a purpose or breath that had learned to run low. "I'm not here to bargain," I said, "I'm here to pass." Which is the kind of lie a man tells a grade, and he liked it for its honesty about being a lie. "Then pass," he said, "and keep count." And he said keep the same way the wind had said say, plain as if he could afford politeness forever. I started along the inside of the switchback where trucks chew ruts, the chain over my forearm because it would not let me put it down without bristling along the links like something alive. 1, gravel made its small decisions under my boot. 2, the smell of iron and musk thick as if a fresh-cut hayfield had been doused in penny water. 3, my breath doing sums on its own. 4, the jar tapping the pack frame with a rhythm I did not like. 5, the grade kneading my calves like a hand finding a knot. 6, the road's edge pressing its thumb into my boot as if to test the leather. I stopped there because stopping is the only honest prayer we have in these parts. And behind me the ditch delivered the 7th step with grace, a hoof or a heel. It doesn't matter, which met the pause with approval. "What are you?" I asked before I could remember not to ask a thing its name. And he tilted his head again as if he'd been waiting for me to want a label more than a rule. "Ledger keeper," he said, amused. "Ditchman," he added softly. "Gate," he finished, satisfied, and each word fit while it was in the air and didn't after, which felt like the truth. A car might have come then and saved me in the small way other people's noise sometimes saves a man from his own, but the day had chosen not to add any noise to mine, so I carried the chain and my quiet and walked because walking is also a kind of counting, even when you won't say the numbers. The road cut back on itself and the next bend showed ahead, a mirror of the one behind. All clay and laurel and narrow apologies, and he kept to the ditch so that we traveled side by side without agreement. His presence measured by the frequency with which the smell told my memory to stand up and pay attention. All the barns I'd ever hid in from summer rain, all the fields where blood ironed itself into soil after a hog killing, all the times a man had come out of the woods with a question and left with a story instead. "That jar," he said after a while, like a man praising a calf he intends to sell, "doesn't belong to your hands even if your people sealed it. Doors don't like to be carried into other doors. I put it down once," I said, "and the ground opened." "Is that what you want?" Sharper than I meant, shameful. He considered, which is a frightening thing to watch in a creature that could simply decide. "We don't want," he said, and for a moment his mouth looked exactly like a man's. "We count." The chain flexed against my arm, a living thing tired of being patient. The culvert ahead had been eaten wide by last winter's water, a round mouth with tooth marks of stone where the flow had worried at its limits. And the dark inside was not the dark of absence, but the dark of attention, the kind that holds its breath so you will notice. He stopped where the shadow began and glanced at the walnut upslope, whose bark had the swallowed fence in it, and without ceremony he reached in and drew the chain forward until the last links inside the culvert scraped loose from mud, hair caught in them and a smear of walnut sap that smelled like a kitchen drawer where the good linens live. "Set it down," he said, and I laid the chain so it crossed the roadbed like a question. It made no sound on gravel, but a quiet rose anyway. The bell-thinking whisper that has followed me since the first time I heard the church toll without a rope. "Now," he said, "step over." And I knew better than to ask why, because crossing is how men in these hills learn who they've been speaking to. I lifted my boot and the grade tilted an inch to help or to test, I couldn't tell. The jar bumped my back as if a hand had reminded me to mind my manners, and the whistle nudged my ribs, cool and complicating. I put my foot down on the far side, the seventh of that short crossing, and the air changed size around me. My hands felt too big, the chain too heavy, the road suddenly wide enough for a story I did not want to hear told at my expense. "Good," he said, and the word was not praise but a check mark in a ledger. "Now you can go," he added, "but we will meet again at the rim where the grass won't grow." And I thought of the circle, and of the goat paths around it, and of the door I haven't opened. I said nothing, which is sometimes as brave as a man can be, and bent to lift the chain because I didn't want to leave it for some truck tire to learn badly. When my fingers closed, the links rose on their own like a well-trained rope answering a bell, and one looped itself around my wrist with the affection of a leash. I tugged and it held, not hard but with the stubborn weight of a promise that has been made by people who are dead and by a place that outlives promises. "Payment," he said, friendly again, "is easier when you carry it with you." And I thought of the map and the hat and the jar shelf and the small private hymns men hum when they have to lift a thing until help arrives. The ditch deepened beside us, the culvert mouth lowering itself as if to drink the light, and for a breath I felt the grade's old trick, the way a road loops you not only in space but in time, so that the next bend is the first bend is the last bend, and you can walk all day and end up where your name got tired. "I don't want to owe you," I told him. Not clever, just honest, and he looked at me with something that might have been pity if a ditch could muster it. "You don't owe me," he said. "You owe the step you already took." And as if to prove his point, the chain tightened a polite notch, the kind a belt learns after a big meal. A sound came then from the culvert, not water, not rock. The sound of chairs being slid back from a table, which is ridiculous on a road, and yet it belonged. My watch, which hadn't cared for minutes since the hollow, ticked once to show it remembered and then stopped as if ashamed of its little effort. From town the bell with no rope gave one strike. Then the ghost of a second without voice, and the road breathed in. "Pay," he said softly, and I lifted the whistle because I am not a man who makes a thing ask twice. I put it to my mouth and felt the grade wait, the ditch wait, the culvert hold its breath like an organ about to take the first chord. And then I did not blow because every hair along my arms and at the back of my neck had lifted to warn me of a rule I did not know. Something in the chain was already singing on a frequency the road preferred, and my breath would only sweeten a recipe that didn't need sugar. The goatman smiled then, small and satisfied, and stepped back into his shadow as if he had finished helping me carry something heavy from the truck to the porch and didn't need thanks. The chain around my wrist slackened a hair to make room for whatever came next. The grade shifted again, the kind of shift that tells you a truck is about to appear where no truck can fit. The culvert exhaled a damp, coin-smelling gust. A footfall clicked behind me, close as a hand on a shoulder. And in the moment before I decided whether to put my breath into that whistle or save it for the room the circle would ask me to build, the chain lifted on its own as if tugged from below, and the road said one in the lowest voice it owns. Story 6. Coffin Creek and the Breath in a Jar. I followed the chain's quiet pull down to Coffin Creek because the road had said one in that low voice it saves for decisions, and because the jar in my pack had cooled my spine the way a sick room cools at dusk when the nurse's change shifts. and I wanted an end to the argument between my hands and the breath I had no right to carry. The switchback fell behind me, the ditch gave up its shadow, and the trees changed from laurel and oak to the poplar and sycamore that, like their feet, washed. White limbs streaked like old bones, roots clutching at the bank where floods had taken polite bites each spring. I smelled the creek before I heard it, that iron-sweet water scent you get when leaves rot in patience and sand keeps the memory of nails. The chain lay loose around my wrist, not heavy, only attentive, and every time I thought to slip it off, a link raised like a vein and said, "Wait." The map in my coat had cooled to a silence that wasn't permission so much as observation, and the whistle at my ribs, my father's, whistle that never sounded when the ground preferred to speak, pressed a cold mouth through cloth as if to remind me that sound is a debt, not a gift. I stepped from root to root down the slope and told myself not to count, then heard myself anyway. 1, the rasp of bark under my palm. 2, the quick slide of dirt as my heel tested a bad choice. 3, the smell of yeast from a dinner no house had cooked in 50 years. 4, a thin thread of blue smoke lifting from no fire. 5, a bird's neck stretched to watch me like a small worried grandmother. 6, the old habit stopping me one pace from the water's lip while the creek whispered its sums. I held there and looked along the bend where Coffin Creek makes its quiet U, bank to bank, a shallow vale in the afternoon shade, set about with stones that looked placed by human hands until you saw how the current had done the arranging. My grandmother used to say this stretch of water took to jars because the valley's dead still owed it air, that people brought the last breath down wrapped in towels and asked the creek to keep the wind honest. And if you listened just after sundown, you could hear the jars thanking or complaining, depending on how careful the thumb had been on the wax. I set my pack on a rock shaped like a shoulder, and the jar made its small home sound inside, glass tapping frame, cotton giving one dry rub against glass. I held it and felt the old cool, not this day's, but the cool of a room where someone stopped breathing long enough ago for the clock to have forgiven itself. The wax had my grandmother's thumbprint sealed into it. That crescent she never could help leaving because she pressed down a little extra, meaning it for kindness. I told myself I would not open it, not yet, that I would let the creek speak first. And the creek, being a place with good manners, did. A long sigh under a log, the faint hiss of sand rearranging itself, a bubble bursting without interest. I listened for wrongness and heard none, which is often when wrongness is closest. I knelt and set the jar where the water could touch just the bottom, not to float, only to learn it. The cotton clouded toward the glass and then settled as if whoever was inside had taken notice. A breeze wandered down the channel, not the choosing wind from Widow's Hollow, just an ordinary slope breath. But even that ordinary motion tried my name on its tongue and let it go, and that was mercy. I looked upstream and down to be certain no neighbor would mistake me for a man doing magic and forget that respect lives in the same hands as curiosity, then tipped the jar to wet the wax so I could peel it clean if I had to reseal fast. "I brought you home," I said, not knowing if the breath inside belonged to our blood, or to the widow my grandmother never forgave, or to some man whose last word had been a small apology caught by an attentive wife. The chain touched the rim with one link and the metal made no sound, but I felt the bell of town roll once in my bones as if sound had elected to travel through me instead of air. A light in the trees went on and off, a leaf turning to show its pale side or something else. Then my watch, which had offended, time at Widow's Hollow and then pretended to behave at the loop, tried to run again and gave up, the second hand trembling like a boy volunteering too late. Pay with sound, the legend had said, and I had learned the trick of tapping when I would not blow. So I took the whistle out and held it above the jar like a preacher holds a cup and waited for the creek to approve. It didn't. Water has no interest in approval. It shapes you by not caring. I tapped my thumbnail on the whistle's lip, small, stubborn, once, twice, 3 times, and the creek answered not with echo but with attention. The surface drew flat, the riffle smoothed, and in the tight mirror I saw my father's hat where it hung on the peg under the graveyard, saw my hand, reaching for it again as if the door had never opened and never closed. Saw the 7 steps of a funeral walk, the 7th not yet placed. I put the whistle down on a dry stone and slid my thumb under the wax. It gave the way skin gives to a needle when a man has decided to be brave, which is to say not at all until it suddenly does. The cotton smelled like clean cloth left by a window in rain. The jar breathed, and it was the smallest exhale I've ever heard. Not a sound the ear takes, but a pressure leaving glass to test a human face. It touched my cheek and cooled me 1 degree, and my mouth, being the treacherous thing it is, answered with a breath of my own. Just a pinch, and the jar accepted me, which I did not intend. Easy, I said, which is what fathers say when they've already lost the argument. Behind me, on the bank, a foot found a stone and decided it belonged there. The old rule rose. In my mouth, don't count, and I counted anyway. 1. And then the last of the wax let go and the cotton puckered. The creek brought its body close around my boots like a dog settling to be petted, and I understood with the simple certainty of a child that if I opened too fast I would give more than I returned, and if I opened too slow I would teach the breath inside that I was making terms with it. There are some things you cannot make terms with. I lifted the cotton. The jar said my name, not in words but in the shape my name makes when it meets the roof of a mouth that has practiced it for years. A scraped H where there is no H, a kindness on the last vowel that belongs to a woman who loved me less easily than her own breath. I wanted to say her name back, and the creek took that want and pressed it flat like a letter between damp pages. Air slid from the jar and the water rose a thin inch to meet it, and there was a sound like prayer spoken under a quilt. For an instant, I felt a room assemble around me, a chair pulled close to a bed, a hand inside mine that I wasn't entitled to keep, my grandmother humming only the tune of a hymn because words would have made her cry. The chain tightened, gentle, then let go, and the jar drew in instead of out. I was not ready for that. Jars are for catching last breaths, not first ones, and this breath wanted another try at being alive. It pulled at the air around my face the way a cold day pulls your cheeks thin, and my body, traitor, offered what it had. Heat, the little steam of my lungs, the expectation of oxygen. No, I said, and the word fell into water like a coin that buys nothing. The breath inside the jar tried again, and this time it brought a syllable, her, somewhere between carry and hurry and a name I will not write. And my knees softened because the creek had been waiting a long time to hear that sound again, and it was using me to bring it. I set the cotton back and the jar fogged hard, then cleared like a window when a child wipes it with a sleeve. Across the bend a shape stood where the shadows meet. Wrong for a man, wrong for a doe, right for the place between. And it did not move, only listened with the patience of an old ditch. The goatman's mouth does strange things to vowels, but water makes everything pronounceable if you give it enough time. You're not mine, I told the jar, and the jar rejected the statement with a polite chill. That is the worst part of this work. You learn that belonging goes both ways. I thought of taking the breath to Alma's house and setting it on the table where new rooms come when names go quiet. Thought of counting my steps past the kitchen door and stopping before the floor learned me. Thought of buying a small mercy with sound and letting the bell with no rope strike once, as if a church could notarize what I was trying to return. Coffin Creek does not like churches. It likes what people do when no one is watching them be good. If I let you go, I said, who pays? Ashamed of the selfishness inside the honest question. And the chain glued one cool link to my pulse to answer, you do. I lifted the cotton again, slower, and the jar took a breath that was not mine. A breath from under the sycamore where a boy once kept his secrets and the tree kept them better. From the bank where a widow bent and did not stand straight for a whole season. From the culvert where things go when roads cannot use them. The map warmed. Yes, even there by water. And I felt letters print themselves against the skin over my ribs. The careful block hand. A new note in the legend. Return what you took where you took it, and if you can't, return it where it was meant to go. I had not taken this breath, but I had carried it. That is enough to owe. I lowered the jar into the current until the lip drank, and the sound it made was not like water entering glass. It was like a mouth recognizing a cup. A leaf passed and turned and circled back like a dog. Something upstream stepped into the shallows and stepped out again to avoid scaring me with its kindness. The jar inhaled and the creek exhaled like they were the same pair of lungs. And the air around my head grew thin in the way a church grows thin after the last amen when everybody pretends to breathe normally. I thought I would faint, and Coffin Creek said, "Fine, we have places for that." The chain tightened again, less gentle, and I knew the grate above me felt my knees and did not approve. I said my father's name inside my mouth without releasing it, and the creek said it back in a voice I didn't deserve to hear. I pulled the jar out an inch, then two. The breath inside had become a small weather. Fog rolling against glass, clearing, rolling again. My skin prickled with the sense you get when a room changes shape while you're not looking. The figure across the bend leaned, and I could not tell if it had horns or a shawl. I set the cotton in place and pressed the wax down with my thumb the way my grandmother taught me. Smoothing the edge, sealing the edge, and as I did, the creek rose one more inch without moving, and pressed its palm against both my shins like a mother steadying a child at the top of stairs. I thought I was done. I thought I had returned what I could and kept alive what I couldn't. That is when the water behind me made the sound of a chair sliding back from a table, and a foot, careful and patient, stepped onto the seventh stone of the crossing I had not yet made, and the jar in my hand, sealed and honest, inhaled. Story 7. The House That Adds One More Room. Took the jar away from Coffin Creek because it inhaled after I sealed it, and because a sealed breath that still wants to breathe belongs somewhere that knows how to keep its manners. And the only place that ever did for my family was Aunt Alma's place on the pasture rim, the house that grew rooms like burrs on wool whenever a name went quiet. The chain around my wrist had slackened to the weight of a promise, not a threat, and every time I lifted my hand, the links remembered a bell they used to pull, the old iron note traveling up my arm like a vein waking. I walked the fence line with the map warm against my ribs and the whistle cold against my heart, and counted without meaning to. 1. The briars testing my pant leg as if for a blood tithe. 2. The dust of long summers lifting under my boots and laying right back down. 3. The smell of yeast rolls that no kitchen on this hill had baked in years. 4. The hush that comes when cows stop looking at you and resume their older business of being weather. 5. The far-off once-only strike of the church bell with no rope. 6. The light on the house siding going from afternoon to evening as if a hand had pulled it across with deliberate care. I stopped there because the pasture keeps its own arithmetic, and because the front steps of Alma's place remember men who don't. The porch has always had a sway to it like a rib cage at rest, and the screen door wears its hinge squeak, the way an old woman wears a brooch, proud of a sound that survived the repairs. I put my palm on the frame, and the wood cooled my skin a degree and then warmed it back, which is how a house says hello when it recognizes your shape. Inside, the hallway breathed with that Sunday morning in winter hush my people make when they're early to church and don't want to admit it. The calendar in the kitchen still held Alma's last month, and the pencil X's stopped 3 days before she did. Beyond the kitchen, where the pantry should have been, the narrow walnut door had moved again. It never stays where you expect it. The grain holds our name the way a tree holds a lightning scar, not proud but permanent. I could smell rosewater under dust and ham bones under memory, and the faint iron of JFG coffee cans that once held nails. I told the house I'd come to return what I could and carry what I had to, and its boards shifted their weight the way a tired man does when he means to stand but isn't ready. When I lifted the latch, the jar inside my pack cooled my spine, and the chain gave a polite tug, as if to remind me the ditch and the grade and the bell were all watching how I behaved in rooms. The new room waited on the other side of the walnut door, already settled into the floor plan as if it had always been there. A modest square leaned into the house's center of gravity, corners a shade too dark where the paint had learned hesitancy, table set for 2 with plates faintly rimmed in dust that wouldn't land on my fingers however I tried. Aunt Alma's chairs, split bottom, smooth with backs worn by coats that never came back, watched me with friendly suspicion. At the far wall stood my grandmother's jar shelf, only it had grown honest while I was gone. Not the tidy row I remember, but a harvest, 2 shelves deep, wax sealing the cotton. The way a thumb seals a letter you can't risk the postman reading. In the middle sat the jar I'd brought, as if the house had reached into my pack while I watched the door and lifted the breath out with the gentleness of a midwife. The wax bore my grandmother's crescent, the one her thumb always left, but the sheen on it was fresh as if someone had breathed on it and wiped it with the heel of a careful hand. My father's hat hung from a peg that hadn't been there this morning. Brim turned to show the sweat-darkened band where he pinched it when he wanted to speak softly. I didn't take it down because I have learned what happens when you put on another man's weather. The map in my coat quit humming and lay proper, which is the most dangerous thing paper can do. I stood on the threshold and told myself I would not count, then heard myself anyway. 1. The plank beneath my boot answering with a low, held note. 2. The air giving up the smell of pond water and pennies because the chain had remembered bell towers. 3. The table letting its legs settle like a sigh after grace. 4. The window shifting from mirror to dark. 5. My father's hat warming a fraction without moving. 6. The floor under the second chair tightening its woven seat as if to help someone sit. I stopped because stopping is the only rule that has ever saved me. And the room waited without hurry, which is worse than hunger. Sit, said the house. The word arriving from the joists and the joists arriving from the sill and the sill arriving from the red clay that remembers each man's weight and doesn't mistake it. If I sit, I said, do you add a door? Ashamed at how small my voice made the question. If you sit, the room said, you count right without counting wrong, which is the sort of answer a place gives when it gets to keep you either way. I set my pack on the table and the jar, without me, moved a thumb's width to place itself between the plates like an honored dish. Condensation ghosted the glass in a slow rhythm, and I realized it wasn't fogging to the room's breath but to mine, which means it had learned me well enough to mirror. I put the whistle down. Beside it, and the chain link around my wrist lifted and settled like a cat acknowledging a lap. Something in the wall, mouse or memory, shifted and paused and shifted again. I reached for the chair with my left hand because the house knows my right and I wanted to surprise it. But old houses don't do surprise, they do precedent. I half sat to test the seat and found it remembered me already. The woven cane dipping to cradle the place as a man keeps worry and stubbornness. The opposite chair held a dent that wasn't mine. I kept my weight on my heels and my heels on the boards as if the floor were a scale I could trick. The jar breathed, the light thinned, and the house brought me a smell I hadn't earned in years. Butter beans with pork tucked low in them, yeast rolls and cold milk. Coffee burned a shade for men who like their evenings useful. I wanted to close my eyes and let it all happen, to be the son who always arrives in time for supper and never has to explain the ditch or the bell or the borrowed lights, but the map against my chest warmed like a warning and printed 3 words on my skin in that careful blockhand I know too well. Pay with sound. Not here, I whispered, and the room, which has heard every whisper my people have made, pretended not to. I touched the whistle and it gave nothing because a man's breath is not a coin you spend in a dining room without the ground's signature. From the yard came weather I knew without looking. The ditchman's musk and iron, the small, attentive patience of a creature that keeps gates, and I saw in the corner of the window not his whole shape but the suggestion of a head meant for briars, and a shoulder meant for hauling. He did not knock. A house like this doesn't admit knocks. It decides. The chain around my wrist, polite a moment earlier, pressed its cool along my pulse as if reminding me that outside belonged to ledgers and inside belonged to reckonings of a different style. We keep doors, the house said, my grandmother's voice speaking through the boards, which is the only way she would. And we keep what passes through them. A jar is a door, child. Don't bring one into another and expect us to make peace without a tax. What's the tax? I asked. And in the kitchen a frying pan clicked against the stove ring and settled, which is how this house has sound. The hat on the peg warmed again and a drift of ash I hadn't noticed lifted and spun in the air near it, then landed without touching me. The room had been dressed for company. A folded quilt over the chair back, the old Bible closed on the buffet, Alma's glasses set upside down on a saucer. I put my hand flat on the table and the wood gave me back the pulse that wasn't mine. The jar's faint rhythm under glass. Steady, small, determined. And a memory rose like steam. My father folding his hands to listen before he spoke. The way he leaned to hear a slow clock through the noise of a house full of hard talk. If I sit, I said, will the room stop adding? And the house laughed, not unkind. Rooms don't add because men sit. Rooms add because names stop. I eased down the rest of the way because the chair already knew me, and resistance would have looked like pride. The woven cane hummed the way a screen door does in a cross breeze. The opposite chair creaked as if a body had done the same. I did not look up. I looked at the jar because I could stand to see glass tell me the truth. The cotton did its small rise and settle. and for one beat I felt a cool on my lip as if someone had leaned close to test whether I would share. I set my tongue to the roof of my mouth and kept silence as if it were a plate I didn't want to break. The house pressed in, a little friendly squeeze, and the corner shadows brightened the way corners do when a story is about to tell itself. "Say his name," said the joists from below, my father's name, passionless as a clerk. "No," I said, and felt the floorboards accept my refusal the way a bank accepts a small deposit. Polite, recorded, insufficient. Across the pasture, a line of wind drew itself and paused at the yard. Respectful as a neighbor who knows better than to walk in, the hat on the peg turned a degree without falling. The map warmed once, then went still. Somewhere beyond the new room, a door that hadn't existed at noon made its first exhale. "You can return it here," said the house, and the word return came with a smell like the inside of a wooden spoon drawer. Memories lined up and rubbed smooth by use. Or you can carry it to where it was meant to go. And I felt the pasture rim find me through the chair legs, that bald circle where the grass won't grow since somebody taught it a lesson. I picked up the whistle and held it above the jar and listened for permission, but none came because permission is a word for men. The chain murmured against bone. The yard held its breath. The opposite chair leaned the way a tired man leans when he decides to speak and then thinks better. I tapped the whistle once against the jar's rim for courage's sake, and the smallest, truest note rose. Glass remembering sand, metal remembering bell, wood remembering tree, and the entire house answered by settling all at once. A gentle downshift that put my weight squarely where it wanted me. 6 planks between the door and the table had learned me. The 7th was a decision waiting under my heel. I lifted my foot to ease the pressure, to deny the house its math, and the new door behind me inhaled again. Longer, as if readying to close. I turned my head a fraction, and in the shine of the window I saw the door's edge where no edge had been. Pale wood with no knob on my side. A latch tongue that would catch softly because the smith who made it had loved his work. The goatman's outline stepped deeper into the yard shadow to see whether I would stand or sit or pay. The jar fogged, cleared, fogged. The hat warmed as if a head had found it. The church bell far off considered and did not strike, and the floor under the table gave the faintest shrug, the kind a bed gives when a sleeper rolls toward the edge. An invitation or a warning. I couldn't tell while the new door behind me drew a breath that was almost a click. Story 8. Devil's Circle on the Pasture Rim. I left the jar on Aunt Alma's table because the glass had started fogging in rhythm with my breath, and because the house had said we keep doors. Child, and a jar is a door. I took the whistle and the map and the chain that had looped itself around my wrist like a polite leash, and I stepped backward out of the new room so that the house could not say I turned my back on it, and the door behind me breathed once like a chest ready to sleep and then clicked, soft as a spoon set down, and I knew it would not open from my side. The goatman stood where the yard shadow meets the pasture light, his outline meant for briars and ditches, head tilted to hear whether I would count. The rim lay a few paces beyond the fence, the bald patch I have avoided since childhood. A coin rubbed thin in the grass where nothing grows and everything remembers, and a line of wind traced itself across the field and paused at the edge as mannerly as a neighbor who knows better than to step on a threshold uninvited. I felt the chain tighten a polite notch and the map warm in my coat with the careful block letters printing again under my ribs. Ledger out, and the whistle cooled at my sternum like a difficult truth. I told myself not to count, and the pasture counted for me. 1, briars tugging my cuff for a blood tithe. 2, dust lifting and laying back down with farmer patience. 3, cows far off turning their faces away to mind older business. 4, the church bell in town thinking about one stroke and saving it. 5, the goatman's musk and iron threading the air with hayloft heat. 6, the fence wire humming without wind as if something had plucked it gently to see if I would answer. I stopped because stopping is the only sermon this hill ever accepted from my family, and the circle waited the way an open ledger waits. Not hungry, not angry, simply sure of its sums. Up close, the bare ground looked less like a burn and more like a place that had been sat upon by many decisions. The edges were neat where the grass leaned in but would not cross, each blade like a parishioner who believes but not that much. When I stepped to the rim, the sky lowered a hand width as if to hear better, and the brown mountain lights that had borrowed shine from me and mine arranged themselves high over the far ridge like small, patient ushers. "Set your book," said the circle without a voice. and I took the map from my coat and laid it flat on the dirt, and the pencil lines that had acted like snakes all week finally lay still as roads are supposed to. The legend in my father's neat hand, or whatever had borrowed his neatness, added a thin rule under the rest while I watched. Return what you called. Keep what you carry. Pay with sound. The chain rose from my wrist to rest its first links on the ground, then lifted its end as if a hidden hand had taken it. It stood upright, not stiff but attentive. A living line taut between my arm and something that waited above the day. I didn't look for the something. I have learned not to stare up when the place under your feet has asked to speak. Across the pasture, the goatman did not move. His attention sharpened to a point so fine it made my skin ache. The wind at my left ear leaned in with my father's cadence and asked, "Say it." And I did not, because graces withheld can be as holy as the ones spoken. The circle did not insist. It knows other currency. I tapped the whistle once against my thumbnail and the sound went down instead of out, soft as a coin slid onto a church plate. The chain answered with a hum I felt in my teeth more than I heard, a bell-thinking note that made the fence wire on both sides of the field start to sing like two thin saws. "Not yet," said the circle, and I understood it wanted the sound I had been keeping back since the loop, the breath that could call or close, the little silver instrument that refused to speak for me, the word I would not give the wind. Behind me the house shifted its weight, polite but present, and in that small settling I smelled cornbread and old coffee, and the bleach my aunt favored, and I knew the new door had drawn closer to latching itself into my family for good. I lifted the whistle and put it to my mouth. The metal tasted like winter and pennies. The map hummed yes, and the chain hummed not yet, and the pasture held its breath. The way a room does when everyone knows the name of the next song but needs you to begin it. I didn't blow. I tapped the mouthpiece on the map's edge, once, twice, and the dirt under the paper tightened, receiving the small payment without gratitude. From town, the bell with no rope finally gave a single strike, and the sound traveled to the rim and slid into the chain like oil, and the links brightened a shade, the color of walnut sap where iron has slept. "Ledger," the circle reminded, and the map's lines blurred as if the earth were writing its own entries under my father's careful columns. Brown Mountains light, counted. Clinchfield's step counted. Widow's Hollow's refusal counted. Goatman's crossing counted. Coffin Creek's breath counted. House's room pending. "What do you want that I have to give?" I asked without bravado, and the circle answered with patience. "Sound you are saving." I thought then of the breath I left on the table inside a jar that still inhaled after I sealed it. And that thought must have walked itself across my face because the circle warmed under my boots like an animal ready to rise. "Not that door," it said, almost kind. "This one." The chain tugged upward and the sky came down another inch. The brown mountain lights rolled along the underside of cloud like marbles in a tin pan, and I could feel their curiosity, the small bright hunger of things that have learned our names from listening at windows. "If I pay," I said, "do you stop counting me?" Ashamed to sound like a boy haggling for fewer chores, and the circle, being a place that does not lie because it cannot, said nothing that I could mistake for yes. Instead, it made the ground under my heels a shade softer, not to trick me into sinking, but to teach me how belonging starts. I remembered my father's whistle never sounding at the yard when the ground preferred to speak for itself. And I knew whatever noise I made now would be taken and used by this rim, and by the rooms it would force my house to add, and by the rails that would hum it to the next man who obeyed a map after midnight. I breathed once, slow, careful the way you do before you lift a deer weight, and I blew. The whistle did not sound. Everything else did. Fence wire sang like glass. The chain shivered a whole tone higher and fixed itself to something I could not name. The sky answered in a low thread that ran through my jaw hinge. The brown mountain lights flared and thinned. Little lanterns checking the faces gathered in the dark. The ground under me settled into a shape that matched my feet too well. "Payment received," said the circle without triumph. "Balance pending." It is a terrible comfort to learn that a place as old as this thinks in ledgers. From the yard the goatman bowed his head the way men do before prayer. Not pious, just practical. Get your posture right so the weight lands where your bones can hold it. And then he looked past me at the house and I felt the new door judge my spine through two walls. "Build," said the circle. The word arrived with a smell of cut pine and wet nails. and the chain at my wrist tightened to the pleasant ache a man feels when he has carried a piano end across a room and set it down without wrecking the varnish. Where? I asked, because however a place considers itself beyond bargaining, it will sometimes answer a direct question. The pasture rim breathed, and the bald patch felt large enough to be a foundation you could pour with 6 good men and one who counts. I thought of putting a room out here under open sky, a foolish thought, but the kind that makes sense when a hill has talked you into its mathematics. Not wood, said the circle, amused. Not walls. You build with the sound you bring and the silence you keep. I did not understand, which is always costly later. The wind shifted to my right ear and offered my father's name with affection and just a trace of reproach. And the map warmed the 3 words I've been reading all night, do not answer, until they almost blistered my skin. Then finish your count, suggested the circle, kindly, cruelly, as if to say you've known all along how this ends. I had and I hadn't. Every place I'd walked in these mountains had paused me at 6 and asked for the 7th in a language I pretended not to speak. I stepped forward or backward. There is a point where those directions change places, and the heel of my boot found that small softness the ground keeps for men it intends to keep. The chain went bright and cold. The whistle cooled to nothing. The fence wires quieted as if a hand had laid across them. From the house, the new door took a breath like a sleeping animal waking, and Aunt Elma's screen gave a contented sigh as if someone had come in who knew how to behave. Take it, said the circle. And for the first time since I was a boy, I wanted to say my own name aloud just to prove I still had it. I didn't. I held the breath in my chest like a jar sealed with cotton and wax and waited for the ground to decide if my 7th step would belong to me or if I would only get to feel it land. The brown mountain lights drew lower as if to witness. The goatman stepped once to keep pace with whatever was about to be added. And when the sky pressed down enough to lift the hair along my arms and the chain tugged my wrist toward a stake I could not see, I raised my foot to finish the number, and the door behind me, the one with no knob on my side, made the softest click I have ever heard. Story 9. The Bell with No Rope. The door's click at Alma's house followed me like a quiet verdict across the pasture, and the chain on my wrist, polite as a leash pressed into your hand by someone you trust against your better judgment, stayed just tight enough to remind me what I owed. The circle had taken my sound and given me a balance pending, the words settling in my chest like a seed that intends to be a root. And when I turned toward town, the sky lowered again, not storm, not dusk, listening, so I took the ridge road that slides past the white church with the leaning graveyard, the place where the gate counts your steps if you let it, because the bell there has a habit of striking once without help, and because a ledger that wants sound often sends you to the source. The map warmed against my ribs and stopped humming, paper holding its breath, and the whistle at my sternum cooled until I felt it through cloth like snow coins against bone. I told myself not to count, and the road counted anyway. 1. The iron taste of fence wire in the air as if someone had plucked it to see if I would flinch. 2. The dry prayer of broom sedge brushing my boots. 3. The smell of yeast and coffee from a kitchen that isn't mine and isn't open. 4. A light on the hill going from window to mirror and back to window like a face deciding what it wants. 5. The goatman's musk in the ditch keeping pace without fuss. 6. The churchyard's frost darkening to show where the day has decided to remember night. I stopped there because stopping is the only bargain I'm allowed, and the tower held still like a held breath. Board edges black against sky. Louvered windows showing slivers of an interior that looked older than wood. The bell, when you get under it, is not grand. It wears its iron like an everyday coat, the kind a man shrugs into without remark for 30 years. Rim chipped by too many seasons, shoulders rubbed by too many hands that meant well and too many that didn't. I stood under the square where pigeons had surrendered their corner to something that doesn't leave droppings and listened to the tower's bones. A thin complaint in the knee braces, a good honest creak where the sill presses back against stone, the hush that comes when old timber decides you might stay if it keeps quiet a moment more. Our elders cut the rope the year before I was born, so the story goes, because boys were ringing the bell at midnight to hear their names thrown back at them by the hollers. And the sound came back thinner each time until one boy got nothing but a breath that was not his. And he slept without waking for 3 days. There was a chain once, the old men said. When the rope rotted and the iron needed a more honest pull, they put it away because iron sings too plainly and the wrong things learn the tune. The chain crawled into a walnut and grew wood around itself until the goatman slid it from bark. like a fish drawn from a dark pocket. Now a length of it lay across my wrist and lifted its end toward the belfry like a dog recognizing a step. I pushed the door. It gave with the soft resistance of paint that has outlived the brush that loved it. The vestibule smelled like lemon oil and damp wool. Hymnals asleep on shelves. The floorboards faithful enough to confess each footfall without making a scene. Someone, maybe the last organist before the keys went brittle, had left a scarf on the back pew, and it held the faint scent of cold air and hair tonic, and the ghost of perfume older than my mother. I kept my eyes to the stairs because stairs are honest. They tell you step by step what you have decided to do. The first tread had that shine feet make where the grain learns patience. The second spoke its small truth back into the post. The third took my weight without complaint. The fourth asked me where I thought I was going with a breath of dust that knew my father. The fifth remembered a boy who ran up these once to see if the view could make him braver. The sixth paused me at a slit window where night had begun to cut itself thin and slide between frame and air. I didn't let the seventh take me. I stood with my hand on the rail and the chain drawing a straight line up my arm the way a plumb bob does when a wall wants to be true. The stair turned and narrowed, and the towers inside felt like the throat of a giant that has learned not to swallow while it thinks. I climbed with care, not because I am careful by nature, but because a tally was being kept by timber, by iron, by whatever had climbed with me. A name at my left ear speaking itself in my father's cadence. I kept my teeth together and listened to the map thrum twice against bone and then go still. At the bell deck the joists were worn like pews, and the wheel that ought to carry rope hung empty, a wooden moon without a tide. The bell itself sat honest and heavy, its clapper hanging like a promise between yes and no. The iron eye that waits for rope had a scar of rust that looked like a healed wound. The chain on my wrist lifted and without help threaded its first link through the eye, then the second, then the third, metal remembering metal like two old men recognizing each other across a funeral dinner. I tried to pull the chain back and it gave me a polite inch to keep my pride. The brown mountain lights came by then, small as watch faces at the louvers, peered in like ushers, curious but well-mannered. The wind brought Widow's Hollow up the tower one rung at a time, not blowing, choosing, and leaned to my left ear and said my full name with the little lift on the middle my father used when he was pleased with me. I didn't answer. I set my thumb on the bell's rim where the lip has been touched smooth by a century of hands that perfect their grief in the touching. Cold iron woke the skin there, and the chain tugged twice, let me, so I gave it enough slack to carry weight without asking my breath for charity. It is a mystery I am not fit to explain why a bell that has no rope will still sometimes speak. It is less a mystery to me now why it wants to, because sound is the only currency the ground takes without writing you down for forgery. I thought of the circle's ledger, payment received, balance pending, and I thought of the jar in Alma's new room fogging to the rhythm of my chest even after I sealed it. And I understood that a man can return what he can and carry what he must and still owe a place more for having walked it. One strike, I whispered. Because up here the rule feels older than voices, and the tower took my vow into its trusses and sat with it. The chain lowered the clapper a breath, no more, and the bell stretched its silence tighter like a skin drum about to admit its first word. I didn't pull. The tower did. Not a swing. A settling. Iron changed its mind about stillness by a degree, and the note formed before the clapper kissed home. A sound rising from metal that had dreamed of it every winter and every drought and every thinning congregation. It struck once, and in that once the map against my ribs laid itself flat in a way paper shouldn't. No curl, no hum, just acceptance. The fence wires across the pasture answered with a long line like a saw guided by a steady hand. The brown mountain lights narrowed to bright coins and steadied. The goat man in the ditch, because of course he had come to the base of the tower and leaned his shoulder like a patient usher, lowered his head without piety and with perfect posture. The sound walked down my jaw into my throat, pressed my breath aside, and went on into the floor and into the sill and into the stone and into the red clay that remembers, and into everything the creek water holds back from the river until the river demands it. The bell ended as cleanly as it began. There was no second strike. The chain loosened on my wrist, just enough to tell me I had given and not been taken. And for a moment I believed I had done what the ledger wanted. That is when the tower asked for my name. Not the wind, this time the wood. Not the hollow's coaxing sweet. This time the truss's patience. Not a voice, this time a shape. Each beam, each brace wrote a letter across the ache of my arms in the old block hand my father used. They arranged themselves where my tendons meet bone and spelled me, and I felt the rightness of it, the way a key feels when it is home and hasn't yet been turned. And I almost said yes. You can't know how close a man can come to giving up without saying it until a place gets your spelling under your skin. No, I said, teeth together, the word riding breath hard enough to make my lips sting where iron had woken it. And the bell, because bells are old instruments and know about refusals, kept still. A step sounded below, soft, careful, exact one, and the tower accepted it. 2. The post gave it back. 3. The dust made room. 4. The air thinned to listen. 5. The goatman shifted his weight like a man moving under a piano to the next handhold. 6. The stair paused at the slit window where the night gets thin. I held where I was because I have become, against all my wishes, a man who lets the ground take what numbers it needs. The 7th step came and did not land. It waited, held up by the same attention that keeps a leaf aloft a breath too long in the woods when the hollow is in the mood to teach politeness. The chain on my wrist tightened the smallest notch, not to pull me, but to ask whether I intended to add to a room that had not yet been built. I looked down the well of the stair and saw no one and felt the tower smile at my need to see. I looked out at the louvers and the lights beyond and watched one light separate from its brothers and hang at eye level like a question that doesn't belong to words. I looked at the bell and the scar on the eye where rope once fretted and where chain lay now like a vein along a muscle, and I understood that a second strike, 2, would not be counted by the ledger as payment. It would be counted as opening. My father's whistle pressed cold against my sternum and a thought came up from the square of the circle. Build with the sound you bring and the silence you keep. And in that sentence I found neither mercy nor instruction I could obey. The tower breathed. The stare, kind as a hand on my back, suggested down. The bell waited, head tilted, patient as a question that knows the answer and wants to see if you will say it. The chain lifted the clapper a hair without my help. I could have taken my breath and left. I could have given the bell a second word and let whatever sleeps between once and again open its eyes. I stood, because standing is the only thing left to a man who is paid with sound and still has not settled his account, and because the 7th step had not yet touched wood beneath it. When it did, the bell would decide whether the next room had my name on the inside of its door. I listened. The tower leaned in. The stair thought the thought into my bones, and then, from somewhere too near to be outside and too far to be my chest, the bell made a noise so small I might have imagined it, a metal breath, a throat clearing, and the clapper moved a fraction closer to home. Story 10. The family that digs sideways. I left the bell tower with its once only word still in my bones and followed the ridge toward our family plot because the circle had said balance pending and because my people have an old answer for debts we can't face on top of the ground. We go under and meet them where we'd rather not. The chain on my wrist stayed polite and attentive. The map against my ribs warmed enough to print a new, thin line under the legend in my father's careful hand, go in sideways, and the whistle at my sternum cooled like a coin I would have to spend, whether I wanted to or not. I told myself not to count as the iron fence came up through broom sedge and frost. But the hill keeps numbers whether a man cooperates. 1. The raw taste of wire in the air as if someone had plucked it to test my courage. 2. The smell of yeast rolls that no house cooks anymore when the wind decides to be kind. 3. A light on the far ridge going from window to mirror and back to window like a face trying out expressions. 4. The goatman's musk threading the ditch with a hayloft patience I have come to respect. 5. The churchyard stones tilting like teeth worrying their own gums. 6. The gate giving back a click soft as a swallowed word. I stopped there because stopping is the only bargaining chip I have left. And I took the slope below the fence to the drainage cut where, years back and a few nights ago both, my people rubbed a rectangle into stone with prayer and stubbornness until a door decided it had always been there. The peg beside it held my father's hat again, felt warm though the air had teeth, and the knot in the worn band sat where his thumb had trained it. I didn't put the hat on because wearing another man's weather is a contract even the dead collect on. I set my palm to the rock and it cooled my skin a degree and then yielded without sliding, as if the mountain had remembered the shape of our insistence and didn't want to be rude twice. The passage beyond took me the way a hallway takes a man who fits it. Height enough if he keeps his pride low. Width enough if he lets his shoulders be honest. Floor packed by 100 unspoken decisions. The smell was the old mixed breath of red clay, root, creosote that seeped down from the loop like a hymn that never stops. And the faint, unblameable sweetness of cotton left in jars too long. I touched the wall with my fingertips and felt pick marks our men left when words wouldn't carry the weight. Marks smoothed by the backs of hands moving lanterns. Here and there, niches cut just deep enough to hold glass, dozens. Some empty and dust-silvered, some with waxed mouths. Each one a sealed door we asked the wind to mind. I moved slow because speed makes noise and noise is a tax, and we're taxed enough. Above me, roots pressed down like fingers through floorboards, one with a ribbon tied on it from a funeral I was too young to understand. And through those root fringes little lights slid, thin as fish in a drought creek. Brown Mountain's curiosity finding its way under our talk. The chain on my wrist raised a link and let it fall in a small metal syllable that went forward through the passage and came back changed. Lower, like a word that has learned manners. You don't get to forgive yourself down here, my father had told me once. In the way a man speaks when he's only pretending to talk about coal. You get to remember better. And the rock under my hand remembered me in return. Son of men who measured distance by how many breaths you could carry from door to creek and back without borrowing from the wind. The passage sloped until it leveled and then turned in a way that took me not toward the graves but along them, under the row where our names face winter, under the line where the seventh pallbearer keeps count with his mouth shut. I could feel each stone in my knees as a pressure, each name a quiet hand on my shoulder approving or not. The tunnel widened into a room that never was a room. Just the suggestion of a place where a table might fit if you lowered your expectations. Beam ends set like ribs, a bench that had belonged to a porch before the porch decided to be a wall, a ledger carved into siltstone with a nail, not columns but two long grooves, kept and returned. Names once cut deep had risen under damp, swollen into their own ghosts. Underneath them, scratched newer and with a neater hand, someone had written carried, and I knew that line was for me. I did not put my name there because the ground writes without your help. I followed a smaller bore that pinched my shoulders and forced me to take my pride off and set it behind me. And I felt where the passage forked. The right-hand way breathing cold like church stone, the left-hand way breathing warm like kitchen walls. I took the warm because warmth is a courtesy and I was due one. After 30 paces, don't count, I told myself, don't, and the floor counted for me. 1, soil crusted with old wax flakes. 2, timber scarred where a lantern had brushed. 3, air that had gathered stories. 4, dust that refused to settle on my hands. 5, a thread of ham and coffee from a house miles and a lifetime away. 6, my father's laugh in my head the way a creek remembers a bootstep, and I stopped and heard the 7th step approach from behind, as if a man I trusted were catching up and did not want to startle me. I didn't turn because side tunnels don't forgive sudden movements. I reached the place where our passage runs directly under Aunt Alma's new room, felt the weight of table legs and jar shelves, and a chair that remembers me settle into my shoulders like a quilt. And the floor. Lifted a hair, not to trip but to measure. Above, the house's new door inhaled. Below, the earth asked if I knew what I was doing with all these doors piled atop one another. We dug sideways, I whispered, so the wind couldn't find our names when we weren't ready to give them. And the tunnel agreed without praising, the way an old foreman gives a nod to a young man's back that is finally learning. Far ahead, a dull white showed where the passage broke into a shallow well of roots and bones and boyhood, the little light a man never deserves under the dark he chooses, and as I crawled, nearer it separated into 3 coins that slid, into one and then into none, Brown Mountain's attention flickering like a child told to hush at the good part. I stopped at a stone door we had never finished, an oval rubbed into the wall until it was almost a hatch, and laid my ear against it. What I heard was not wind, not water, but chairs being slid back from a table, that house sound that follows a blessing. And I knew the room beyond was not made of lumber. Build with the sound you bring and the silence you keep, the circle had said. And I understood suddenly, not mercifully, that this was how our family added rooms no blueprint could show. You bring down a word the ground will take. You keep back the word it wants and the earth shapes the rest. The chain tightened, neither order nor plea, and I looped its free end through a ring we had set in stone for exactly this reason. A lifeline taut through limestone. Then took the whistle from my shirt and held it in the dark, not to blow, only to let metal learn the temperature of my mouth. "I'm not coming to bargain," I said to no one I could see. "I'm coming to pay where I should have paid first." And from the other side of the unfinished door a breath answered, the kind a jar remembers after cotton is laid. Not a demand, just a refusal to be forgotten. I tapped the whistle once against the rock, one, twice, two, and on the third. The stone under my palm warmed as if someone on the far side had put their hand there to meet mine through the wall. The goatman's smell reached me even here. Clean iron and wet hay, a ditch's patience. And a voice not voiced said from the branching dark, "When you dig sideways, you only change the weather, not the debt." Which is the sort of truth that makes a man want to argue and then makes him quiet. The map in my coat thrummed once and went still as good paper. I pressed my shoulder into the oval and it yielded a finger, then two, and I slid into a cavity that had been waiting to decide whether I deserved it. Low, rounded, roots woven across the ceiling, a bench of packed clay shaped by the weight of men who never confessed how they made it smooth. Jars sat in the wall niches, 3 to a side and 1 in the center. Empty, cotton fresh, wax clean, a door waiting for a word. I didn't have the word that jar wanted, that belonged upstairs at the table, fogging to my breath. I had something worse. The whistle the circle had taken without sounding and returned to me as a bill. "Kept," I whispered, touching the carved groove where our elder scratched that column. "Returned," touching the other. And under my finger, the stone prickled as if the letters were pores on a living skin. "Carried," I said, and the passage accepted the confession. The unfinished wall answered by letting a seam appear. Hair-thin, then child-thin, then wide enough for a man to remember crawling under porches in summer. And behind it lay what my father never showed me. The old shift, our family's underroad. A hallway of earth tamped flat by funeral boots moving parallel to the world. A place where the 7th step is taken sideways, not forward. I went in because I already had. My feet knew the way. The chain around my wrist made a small sound, iron surprised at its own tenderness. And I followed the low curve as it ran beneath the pasture rim. Above, I felt the circle of bare ground consider me through 6 feet of dirt. Ahead, a breath of air moved toward me from the church direction, not blowing, choosing, and with it came the thinnest note, something between root rub and bell bone. And I knew a second strike in that tower would count as opening here where we dig. "Not tonight," I said to the wood and the stone and the ground that owns both, and I kept my lungs stingy. At the next bend, the floor softened, a polite warning that we had reached the part of the house below the house, and I saw, without seeing Aunt Alma's new door above me, knobless on my side, breathing like a sleeper, learning someone is in the room. "We built rooms so the wind would find somewhere else to stand," I said. And the tunnel smiled the way clay can, by holding, and then letting go one handful at a time. The last span brought me under the table, under the jar shelf, under the chair that had learned my shape. And there the sideways path ended at a wall with a single stone the size of a bread pan set loose. The brick my grandfather said a boy could pull if he wasn't too proud to crawl. I slid my fingers into the gap and eased it out. The house answered by sinking a fraction. Not afraid, only aware, and dust sifted into my hair in the shape of flour. Through the hole I saw nothing at first. Then a thin string of light like the line of wind that writes itself across the pasture and pauses at the fence. The chain tightened, asking if I meant to finish what I'd started. My watch, which had been sulking since Widow's Hollow, ticked once to show it could still be obedient. Above me a chair moved. No scrape, just the weight shifting across woven cane as if someone had decided to speak and then thought better. I put the whistle in my pocket so I would not spend it by accident, and slid my shoulders into the hole as far as they would go. The clay around me cooled my ribs and warmed my stubbornness. I reached until my fingers touched the underside of floor, boards old as anybody's promises. And in the breath I held, I heard a single footfall cross above. Soft, careful, exact, 1, and the house's new door breathed in, 2, and the jar on the table fogged and cleared, 3, and the goatman's weight settled into the yard shadow like a patient witness, 4, and the fence wire hummed without wind, 5, and the brown mountain lights peered through cracks as if ancient things were allowed to be curious when men are honest, 6, and the plank under my fingernails flexed to memorize me. I waited for the 7th, and it did not land where I expected. It arrived sideways, under me, behind me, inside the clay itself, as if the ground had decided to take the step on my behalf. And in that shift the hold tightened around my chest, The stone I'd pulled rocked, and the passage inhaled like a lung that has finally remembered what it is for. The chain around my wrist lifted of its own will. The whistle pressed cold against my heart. The map warmed with a word I could not read from the inside. And the house above me, polite as a ledger and patient as a ditch, said nothing at all, while the earth made up its mind about whether my next breath would belong to me or to the family that digs sideways. I have paid with sound, and still the ledger says pending. The map lies quiet in the lockbox, but some nights I feel its hum through the wood like a small animal breathing. Alma's house has kept the new door closed, polite as a secret. The jar on the table fogs to someone else's rhythm. I do not open it. I do not say any names. When I walk the fence at dusk, the pasture line draws itself and waits. The goatman keeps to the ditch, patient as weather. From town, the bell without a rope sometimes speaks once and falls silent, as if thinking better of a second word. Down in the cut, the Clinchfield rails hold a note you hear with your bones. The lights over Brown Mountain drift in 2s and 3s, listening like old ushers who remember my father. Widow's Hollow still asks for my voice in my father's cadence. Coffin Creek asks for my breath back, though I returned what I could. The circle at the rim pretends to be only dirt and then remembers its sums. Our family tunnel keeps cool, and the hat on its peg warms when I pass. I keep my count without speaking. I step wide of 7, but I know the ground is patient. It carries a man's measure longer than his name. If you come here, bring nothing the wind can borrow. Fold your maps before midnight. Do not whistle when iron is listening. If a door appears where no door should be, let it breathe without inviting it to close. And if you hear one footfall behind you when you have counted 6, do not turn. Keep walking as if the road is yours, because it is, until the mountain decides you've taken your 7th step.